welcome everyone who was able to find a link that works for this webinar. The good thing is it's being recorded, so people will have an opportunity to both look at the presentation and hear the recording later. So I'll just kick off with an introduction. So this webinar is part of a series that we've been holding about hemp. This is the 6th or 7th of the webinars on a Thursday at this time. So thanks for everybody for finding the time today. I'm Susie Hodgson from the Center for Sustainable Ag. Heather's here on audio, and she, as most people know, runs the Northwest Crops and Soils program with Catherine and some other people from Extension as well. Today we'll be talking about hemp pre-harvest sampling. We have several people from the Vermont Agency of Ag, Food and Markets. We have Mike DiTomasso, who will be kicking off the presentation, taking us step by step through the new protocol for testing your hemp. So he's going to share with us shortly a PowerPoint presentation. Following that, we have his colleague Bob, who will be talking about the new hemp testing requirements that will be required now. And we also have Stephanie on the phone, who is pretty much in charge of Vermont's hemp program. So lots of people with us today to answer your questions. We'll start with a PowerPoint. We'll have questions at the end, and also be 2 quick survey poll questions. If you're on your screens, they'll pop up, and if you can answer those, that would be great. So thanks to our sponsors, which is the Northeast Extension Risk Management Education, USDA, and NESARE. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mike DiTomasso to get us started.
Hey, I don't know if Stephanie, if you were planning to kick it off. I remember you mentioned that to me yesterday, but I'm happy to get going as well.
Have at it, Mike.
All right, just get my PowerPoint up here. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep. Yes, perfect.
All right. So I am Mike DiTomasso. I am the hemp program inspector. Also handle technical assistance when it comes to registrations, and I've been providing outreach in general about our rules. And I've been digging in a lot on this one specific topic, which is pre-harvest sampling for compliance with our pre-harvest sampling protocol. It's definitely a bit of a science to it, so I've been digging in the past few months, and happy to share this with folks because we're getting close to harvest time. So just gonna introduce the topic real quick. Gonna talk about what pre-harvest sampling is from a definition standpoint, why pre-harvest sampling is important, what are the necessary forms and required documentation for pre-harvest sampling. That's another really important piece that I think is kind of overlooked at the moment, just as important as doing the sampling. Going to briefly mention some of the differences between our program and USDA's sampling requirements, and we'll talk about that more further down the line. And then I'm going to really dig into the process of how to take pre-harvest samples from a materials list standpoint and just from a procedural standpoint. But before I get into that, I just wanted to provide an industry update to kind of show where we are in Vermont right now versus last year. So currently we have 552 total registrants, that's growers and processors, 1,530 roughly acres registered, and 97 personal use registrations. So that's a significant chunk, because almost 100 are just for personal use. In 2019, we had 1,300 total registrants and about 9,000 acres registered. Seems like a huge difference, but we're actually, I think, much closer to some of the 2019 numbers than we actually think. This year, folks that both grow and process can apply on the same application. And last year they had to fill out different applications to be a grower and a processor. In addition, last year, a lot of growers sent in multiple applications for different growing sites. So I think that number 552 is just a sort of a rough guess, is probably 2/3 of where we were last year. And I think I've heard from Heather Darby that last year we had about 3,000 to 3,500 acres actually planted in the ground. So we're at about 50% of the acres last year, which isn't totally surprising given the state of the market. All right, so what do we mean by pre-harvest sampling? It's a required practice by us and the USDA. It is taking representative flower cuttings from harvest lots to create samples for compliance purposes. It's different than sampling for marketing purposes, although you can use those samples for marketing if you want. It's also documenting the procedure as part of required records as well. So that's another really important part of the procedure. And submitting those samples to a laboratory to get tested and keeping those records for 3 years. Why is pre-harvest sampling important? Basically determining compliance with the acceptable potency level and compliance with certain contaminants depending on your land use before harvest. So we want to make sure that your crop is compliant with certain things before you actually harvest it. And just to go over the acceptable potency level, right now our program has set 0.3% delta 9 THC and 1% total THC as our acceptable potency level, with 1% total THC sort of being an additional limitation. And in addition, all harvest lots need to be tested for pesticides if they're not certified organic, and also need to be tested for heavy metals if the previous land use was an orchard or wasn't in ag use, and there's some other parameters around that. Both of those pesticides and heavy metals, Bob is going to get into a little bit later in the conversation. He's going to go through some of the action limits that we've set for fall harvest 2020. So that kind of brings me into when we take pre-harvest samples. Our program has set up a pre-harvest sampling window of 28 days. So the crop has to be in flower. That's important. And you have 1 to 28 days to pre-harvest sample before harvest. And I think the key here is to really make a harvest plan so that you know when you're going to take your pre-harvest samples. And we get sort of this question a lot of, what if I take my pre-harvest sample 28 days before I harvest and some of my cannabinoid potency levels go up during that time? Do I have to retest? And if I retest, is that considered a compliance sample? And the answer is no. You just need that one sample for compliance purposes. As long as you take it within that 28-day window, you're totally fine. You can do another sample if you want a day before harvest, and that could be for marketing purposes or whatever you want. We just need that one sample for compliance. So before I dig too much farther into the process, there are a few really important definitions to remember and to be aware of. The most important definition for sure is the harvest lot. So word for word, the definition of the harvest lot from our rules is a grower's harvested hemp produced during a single growing season in a contiguous area and containing the same cultivar or variety. The two most important keywords in that definition are contiguous and variety. And we also can consider a variety a phenotypic expression of a cultivar that you have. So if you're buying your seeds from Oregon CBD, Suver Haze is a variety, Lifter is a variety. Say you have cherry wine from two different breeders, we would consider those two different varieties. Therefore, those would be two different harvest lots if they're different phenotypes. So I just as an example of what a harvest lot would look like, say you're growing 4 acres, and you've got 3 varieties. You've got Suver Haze, Hawaiian Haze, and Lifter. You've got an acre of Suver Haze in your backyard. You've got an acre of Hawaiian Haze in your backyard. And then you have an acre of Lifter in your backyard and an acre of Lifter in your front yard. You have 3 varieties, but you'll have 4 harvest lots because that Lifter that you're growing out front and in your backyard isn't contiguous. So that's another big thing to remember. Whoops, let me go back. So if the harvest lot, if your varieties aren't contiguous, then they're different harvest lots. I also wanted to point out the distinction between what a sample is and what a cutting is. A sample is just the homogeneous collection of cuts that you're taking during pre-harvest sampling to make up your sample. And there's a prescribed amount of cuts that you need to take depending on how large your harvest lot is to make up that sample. A lot of times I use the word interchangeably because it's just easy to say you need to take 29 samples per harvest lot, but what I really mean is you need to take 29 cuts per harvest lot, which makes up your sample. So you don't need to do 29 individual tests, you just need to do 1 test per harvest lot. So now I want to dig into really the process and start with just your basic list of materials. I'm sure there's more that you'll need to do pre-harvest sampling, but this is the list of materials that we have on our procedure that will be essential for your pre-harvest sampling. So first, we have said that you need a paper bag to hold your samples. It's always a good idea to check with the laboratory you're choosing because they might request that your sample come in a specific container. But we've said paper bag in the past because it allows for a little more airflow than a plastic bag would. We're trying to prevent any mold growth, any bad things from happening while your sample is traveling to the lab. Your pre-harvest sampling form, really good to print out a bunch of copies of the form and have that form ready for pre-harvest sampling day. That's a very important document that I'll discuss in a few minutes. We'll go over how it looks. In addition to the form, you will need to fill out an aerial image of your harvest lots. So you can just use the aerial image that you submitted as part of your application that shows your cultivation area and your cultivation boundaries. And I'll get into how to fill it out in a couple of slides. Also need some clean scissors or snips or whatever you want to call them. Make sure they're clean before you sample every harvest lot. Gloves. You're going to want some tape or some evidence tape to seal your sample after you're done sampling each harvest lot. So the lab knows and that we know that the sample hasn't been tampered with. And then another really important piece is that you need a cooler with some ice to keep your samples cold. Pre-harvest sampling might take a few hours, and you want your samples to remain cool that entire time before you get them over to the lab. Again, so nothing bad happens in the meantime. So I think it's a really good idea to come up with a harvest lot plan before you actually go out and conduct pre-harvest sampling. So I think this will also help determine when it is you're gonna harvest. And I think the first thing that really is important is just to determine how many harvest lots that you have. And maybe some of you on the webinar, after this webinar, you might realize that you have more harvest lots than you thought. So determine how many harvest lots you have. And then you're gonna wanna figure out how many samples you need per harvest lot. So we have this table over on the right-hand side. It's the statistical method that basically shows how many samples you're gonna need depending on the size of your lot, either by plant count or by area. So if you have a really small harvest lot, 1 to 13 plants, all of those plants are going to need to be cut from in order to make your sample. If you have a half an acre, that's most of the way down to the bottom, 272 to 885 plants, you're going to need 28 cuts to make up your sample. And then if you have an acre or more for your harvest lot, that's 29 cuts. So definitely good to know those numbers ahead of time. Also great to plan out your aerial cultivation maps, so you have those ready and you can circle which harvest lots you have on those cultivation maps, and create a sampling plan for each harvest lot. So when you get out there, you just have to go and do it, and the documentation that you're gonna need to do won't take you that long. You also have your pre-harvest sampling form, and there is certain information that you can fill out ahead of time that will also help you get it done quicker, like filling out which variety is in which harvest lot, and there's some additional information with that. So I mentioned the pre-harvest sampling pattern. It kind of falls in place with how many cuts you need to take per sample. We've prescribed this X pattern, and basically the requirement is that you take samples from the two top boundaries of your harvest lot, and you're doing an X through the middle of that harvest lot. We realized that not every field or harvest lot is a perfect square, so as long as you're able to get those two top boundaries and an X through the middle, that's really what we're looking for. In addition, we also understand that there might be certain field conditions or factors to why you can't do a perfect X through that lot. So we just ask that any deviations from this pattern be recorded in the pre-harvest sampling form. So it's important also, once you figure out this pattern, to figure out how many cuts you're going to need to take per row. So for example, if your harvest lot is an acre or larger, you'll need to take 29 cuts. So that's roughly 7 cuts per row, and then you're going to need to take 1 additional cut on another row to make up your sample size. It's just a good idea. This is up on our protocol to go over this and make sure you've created a sampling pattern for each harvest lot before you go out there. Again, because especially during this first year, I think pre-harvest sampling will take a little bit longer than people are thinking it might take. So we also have some prescribed ways of taking the samples. So cuttings, they have to be for random plants using the sample pattern, but you can't just, decide which plants you're going to take from beforehand. We have asked that samplers take 2 inches of floral material from sidearm flowers. So we're not asking for top colas. We're not asking for bottom material. We're not asking for leaves and stems. 2 inches of flower from sidearm flowers, which is a little different than what USDA has asked of us. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Also, the cut should not contain dead, diseased, or pest-infested material. It can't be a moldy cut that's that might infect the rest of your sample. The registrant has to be present during pre-harvest sampling. Ideally, they should be the one doing it, but they just need to be present because they're going to need to sign off on the pre-harvest sampling form when each harvest lot is finished. As soon as you're done sampling your harvest lot, you need to throw that sample in a cooler to be kept cold. And they just need to be managed in a way that prevents them from being contaminated from non-sampled material. So you can't take your pre-harvest samples in in a cardboard tomato box that you just harvested tomatoes in the day before, because it's just gross and you never know what's in the box. So it's best to just throw them right in the paper bag. Samples must not be commingled with other lots. That's a huge one. Definitely have to keep them separate. And in the future, all samples will need to be submitted to a certified lab. All right, I just want to go over the pre-harvest sampling form a little bit. So I'm actually going to go to this slide and I'll come back. This is what the form looks like. It's available up on our website on the resources and guidance page. So if you take a look at it on the left-hand side, it's asking for the sampling entity name. It wants your harvest lot number. So we're saying for at least this year, your harvest lot number will be the last 4 digits of your grower registration number, the sampling year, and then a unique numerical identifier. And I have an example I'll show you on the next slide. We're looking for the date the sampling started, and the time that it started, and the time that it was completed. And over on the right-hand side, we want to know if it was a crop for CBD or cannabinoids, or was it a fiber crop? What was the harvest lot? Was it in a field or a greenhouse? Also want to know what your declared harvest date is. That's another important piece. And then down at the bottom, there's a written description, and that's where you can write in any deviations you made in the field, or anything that happened during pre-harvest sampling that you'll want to document. I think I captured just about everything there. And another important piece is that the pre-harvest sampling form and the aerial maps will need to accompany the samples to the laboratory. So as a grower, you'll want to print out and have a couple copies of each, the pre-harvest sampling form and the aerial maps, so that you have a copy and the lab also has a copy. So this is an aerial pre-harvest sampling form that I created, and it just has a couple crucial elements that I want to go over. Has my farm name at the top and the address of the farm, and then it has the date on it as well, the date that I pre-harvest sampled. And then in the boxes, it shows my sampling pattern for each harvest lot. So if you take a look at number 3, which is the orange box, Suber Haze, you can see that that's not a perfect square. It's kind of a squiggle. So I just did my best to make sure I sampled the top and the bottom of that lot and got the X through the middle. I didn't put each individual cut I took on this map. You can do that if you want, but I think the most important part is that you showed the route that you took, specifically if your harvest lot isn't a perfect square. So also, if you notice, number 1 and number 4, the red and the green box, those are both lifter, but because they are not contiguous, those are different harvest lots. So I just want to reiterate that point, that any cultivar that's not contiguous is a different harvest lot. Also, after each cultivar, down at the bottom, I have assigned a harvest lot number. So I've given my registrant grow number, which is my number, and the year of pre-harvest sampling, and then I just added 001 to the end of that number. So you can add any number you want at the end of that harvest lot number, just as long as it's easy to follow and each harvest lot comes after the next. So it's easy for someone to read the records. So that was basically it for pre-harvest sampling and how it's done and what are some of the required records. I wanted to mention what USDA requires because we're still unsure of if we'll be operating under their plan come next year. So I just wanted to present some of the differences now to get it on everyone's mind. So none of these are required for fall harvest 2020, but some of the differences is that when they are requiring a cut to be taken, they are requiring the top third of the plant to be taken. So basically the top cola, that top third of the most potent part of the plant, they need that as each individual cutting. Their window for pre-harvest sampling is also about half the amount of time ours is for now. They have put out a 15-day pre-harvest sampling window, and ours is 28 days. In addition to that, samples can't be taken by the registered grower, and they have to be taken from either an agency representative or a certified sampler. So we haven't really worked out what that's going to look like yet, if that is a reality for us, but it'll certainly be different for the industry come in the future if we have to operate under their rule. Also, their acceptable potency level is different than ours. They are saying that Delta 9 THC and total THC both have to be 0.3%. Whereas we deploy the additional limitation of 1% total THC. So there is quite a difference there. And I just wanted to mention that if you want your crop to be considered under the 2014 pilot program, which is what we have been operating under, then it needs to be harvested before October 31st. As long as you harvest before October 31st, then that crop is compliant. It's still good to go, even if the rule comes into effect November 1st. They have told us that that's their stipulation, basically. I also wanted to give a Trace update because Trace is now live. It's our new registration portal. paper applications no longer required. You can fully apply online, has the ability to do all your mapping online. You can pay online, which is great. I know that'll be awesome for a lot of people. Emails, if you were registered in 2020, emails have been sent to you for instructions on how to log in. We have been experiencing somewhat of a technical difficulty with that, but I think that's being resolved currently, or it is already resolved. So we'll reach out about that as well. And in the future, you will have the ability to upload all your required records and documentation into Trace as well. So any COAs that you might have, your pre-harvest sampling forms, your aerial map or pre-harvest sampling, that can all be uploaded, which will make record retention much easier for registrants, and it'll be great for us as well. So that's all I have for pre-harvest sampling. I'm going to turn it over to Bob, who's going to mention some testing requirements we have for fall 2020. But if you have any additional questions about pre-harvest sampling, I'm here after Bob to answer any questions, and you can also reach out to me anytime through email or phone call. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, you're in charge of the screen as well, so thanks. Good job, Mike. I'm Bob Shipman. I'm with the Hemp program, and I'm the Cannabis Quality Control Program Compliance Specialist. It's a huge title, but basically in charge of setting up certified hemp control programs. So this is going to be required testing. That's for this fall's crop, 2020. So we're getting those tables now. Table 2 will have, it'll be part of this document here, and then it'll also be on our website probably in another week or so. And it's actually the same as table 1, which is in the hemp rule. So you probably, all you folks have already seen that. So that's going to be your required testing now. So which products have to be tested and stuff. And also in that required testing, so for the Cannabis Quality Control Program, tables 3 through 8 are going to list the parameters you need to test for. You know, of course, for potency, you're going to have delta-9 THC, you're going to have CBD. Other parameters are going to be, you know, moisture content. Are you going to do water activity or moisture? Which pesticides you're going to test for? And we're going to have associated action levels for all those that must be met. So if you fail an action level, or if you exceed an action level for any parameter, whether it's potency or for contamination, that will fail that harvest lot. So, and again, we want to reiterate that trim flower is considered a processed lot. You have chopped that and you have changed that harvested crop. So now that becomes a processed lot. Certification of laboratories. Can we go back to the screen, Mike?
Yeah.
Thanks. Certification of laboratories. We're going to be begin certifying laboratories once our quality control program, cannabis quality control program, has been finalized. We're getting very close. So once that happens, testing compliance samples will require a certified laboratory. So, and then you're going to be required to have to use a certified laboratory for compliance samples once that's the case. Okay. This is table 2 of the Cannabis Quality Control Program. So, and again, this is the same as table 1 in the Vermont Hemp rule. So it's a little bit different to read because we've got it in green on this PowerPoint presentation, but right at the top up here is the harvest lot, the top left. And you're still going to be required to test for potency. You're still going to be required to test for moisture because you're going to, the calculation is going to be done for a dry weight. The only other different thing is going to be now if you're not a certified organic crop, you're going to have to test for pesticides. And we have 17 pesticides we're looking for. Our list is different from every other state, not on purpose, because we're trying to target pesticides that have been hemp related issues, either in our state or other states. California tests, I think, 64 compounds. Oregon has quite a list too. So our list is longer than some and shorter than a lot of the big major producers. So we have associated action levels with those as well. You will be required to test for heavy metals if the land was other type of ag use or non-ag use, and if it was an orchard, or you can do a soil test. So the notes will be on the next page, and we'll go through those pretty quick. But we're basically going to be looking at probably, go back to the last one, please, Mike. you're going to be testing probably pesticides and just potency and moisture when you send your crop in for a harvest lot. For plant material, trim flower, now since that's a processed thing, you can carry your potency down from your harvest. You're going to be required to test now for microbiological, which is mycotoxins, aerobic microbial, and combined yeast and molds. Some of our other states have required this test, and that's an important test because people can get sick by smoking moldy hemp. So we're going to require that test, and we do have limits for those. Some other states have seen failures for mold in trim, so you're going to have to plan for that. If you've got a moldy crop, you're going to have to do some type of remediation. Heavy metals is going to be required unless you're carrying it down from your harvest lot. So basically, we're adding the microbial for the trim flower. As you work your way down into processing, once you do a concentrate, so you've taken that harvest lot and you've concentrated that down into a solvent. Now you're still going to be required to do potency. We're adding the microbial, and you're going to have to do heavy metals, and you're going to have to do pesticides. So that is a high-end product. With that concentrate, you're making many products. So we're trying to find the source. If there's something wrong with it, we don't want a lot of products to get on the market. We don't want tinctures and edibles out on the market made from a concentrate that's bad. So that's why we require the most testing of the concentrated products. So, and you also have to test for residual solvents if you've used those in your batch somewhere. If you've used like methanol for redissolving or whatever, you're going to have to test that entire batch because there are impurities in some of the solvents you're using. So there's a list of it's approximately 10 solvents you have to look for. Infused products, basically everything is going to carry down from your test above, from your concentrates. So you're not going to be required to test for infused products or solids, but you're going to have to concentrate, and you're going to have to have a formula that you've made it basically a dilution out to make sure that your products are compliant. I believe if you're making a cannabis or a cannabinoid number on your label and you're making a claim, then you will have to test at least one of those products to start to make sure that your process worked. I had my concentrate, I didn't destroy all the cannabinoid in my process, and I'm saying I've got 40 milligrams in a package or something. So you're gonna have to test at least one of those products to show your process is working. Next slide, Mike. Thank you. This is the notes that correspond to the previous page, and we talked a lot about these. So you can go in there and you can take a look at those. So we try to make it, if you're doing testing already, that you wouldn't have to do that. So if you already had a metals test or a soils test, that would be good. If you were certified organic, you're already required to do pesticide testing on your farm. So we wouldn't require that as well. Next slide. So these are some of the testing parameters and action levels we're looking for. Potency, you've got to meet that 0.3% of delta-9 THC and the total of 1%. That's with the Vermont program. If you're making label claims, we're asking that they're within 10% of the label. There's a microbiological limit as well. So we've got mycotoxins, you got combined yeast and mold, you got total aerobic. There are different levels, whether you've got a dried product or a concentrate or a tincture. Move this screen real quick. And then for moisture, we have levels set for those. And those are just for trim flower, because if that product's going to sit around and more than a 13% moisture or water activity of 0.65, there's a risk of that molding. And the molds can actually form mycotoxins, or there's mycotoxins in the molds. So we're trying to head off that issue and problem as well. And then with the metal parameters, we're looking at, we have levels set for those as well, different for trim flower and concentrates, and then we have soil action levels as well. Next page, Mike. Thanks. And the reason we were setting these limits, the Vermont law required that we set up a Vermont program, and we're trying to create and make sure the brand is clean and pure. We don't need a crisis in the industry of moldy hemp or pesticides issues that other states have seen, and labs that have not tested correctly. And there's been big crisis in other states out west. So we are trying to head a lot of that off right now and give more certainty in the industry and make sure the Vermont brand and product is clean. So I digress, but here's a table 7 is the pesticide parameters list. And you see there's 17 compounds in there, and there's different action levels. So whether that corresponds to either concentrate or your crop if you're testing it. And again, why we require that in the crop is that sometimes with the concentrates, these organic compounds have come out in the concentrates, and you see them at the higher levels because you're taking part per trillion levels that may have blown in from somewhere else, and you'll see a concentrate level of those that could kick in. So, but these action limits are the same whether it's a concentrate or a product. And residual solvent is table 8. You can see those parameters there. So again, if you use any solvent in your extraction process or your processing process, you will have to test for residual solvents as well. Next slide, Mike. Thank you. That is us, and we're ready to field questions, I think, right, Mike?
Yeah,
Okay,
definitely.
good.
Great. Well, thanks. That was excellent and information packed. And as you always know, there are tons of questions for the two of you, and I know some of them were being answered as we went. But we'll kind of get into them. And this one is from Gary Fish. Gary's in Maine, and maybe you answered this already. But will you allow stapling as a method to seal the bag as opposed to evidence tape?
Yeah, I sent an answer to that, and I said it kind of depended upon the laboratory. I know Rebecca Harvey is on as my name on one place on here, but with the agricultural lab down in Randolph, they want to see a good seal, so they want to see some kind of sealed tape on there and stuff like that, whether it's tape or evidence tape or something. So it's going to be particular to your lab. Some labs going to want to see paper, some are going to see plastic. So I definitely talk to the laboratory you're going to use. I don't know if there's anything you can add, Mike.
No, yeah. I think most important to check in with the lab and see what they require.
So basically, if a lab is certified by the state of Vermont, then you've already said, what you're requiring of your clients meets our standards. So you're not really saying that they have to use evidence tape. That's really up to the lab to determine.
Yeah, that's right, because
okay.
They're going to have their own standard operating procedures for sampling, sending crops in, sample handling, and then processing and stuff like that. So for us to dictate to every lab that you have to do it a certain way, we're trying not to do that.
Okay. Okay, next question. If after our compliance test, we decide we'd like to wait more than 28 days to harvest, can we do a subsequent compliance test and wait 28 days after that new test, essentially substituting the earlier report for the later one for compliance purposes?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I think as long as you have a second compliant COA, then you should be fine. But I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that. If Stephanie or Bob, you have a different opinion.
Yeah, that first one is invalid, since if you've done it and you waited after 28 days, you got to do it again anyway. So now the next test that you're doing is to determine compliance pre-harvest again. So that second one now becomes your test. The first one was just good information, I guess you would say. But so it really is critical when you get sampled and how long it takes the lab to get the result to you and how fast you can harvest. So that's why we have 28 days. DEA has gone, or USDA has gone to 15. So that requires a quick test, and you got to get out in the field and get that thing harvested quickly as well. So hopefully the 28 days gives you a little more flexibility as a farmer.
Great. So we're going to keep answering questions, folks. So type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box. And then, Catherine, maybe you can also launch the quick poll that people can answer while we continue to go through the questions. So I'll ask a couple of easy ones so people can answer our questions. Is there a link to the tables that you were showing, that you were talking about, Bob? The table 2, I think it was, and is there a link to that we can share?
We are going to put that on our website. I believe it's going on next week. I've got a copy, or actually it is also table 1 that is in the hemp rule. So that's the same as that table 2. But the list of contaminants, we're hoping to get that on the website next week.
Okay. Okay. So another question is, when you say cuts, does that mean a leaf or something else? Can you be a little more specific?
Yeah, cut is the 2 inches of floral material from sidearm flowers that I mentioned. So that's basically our prescribed cut. That's what is going to make up your total sample. Is 2 inches of sidearm flowers. That's the cut.
Okay, great. All right. So somebody is asking, you mentioned that the state was going to need to do the sampling at least next year, probably with the new USDA samples. So somebody is asking, are you saying you're going to have someone from your agency go to every, site to take samples this year? But I think you meant next year, correct?
Yeah, so that's if we're operating under USDA's rule next year, and that's still slightly unclear. But if we are, then basically someone other than the registrant is going to need to take samples, and it could be someone from the agency like me. Also the possibility to have a third-party sampler that has been certified by the agency to go out and collect those samples. That's what the USDA has required, and as far as we've heard from a pretty recent conversation, they're unwilling to budge on that front, which is challenging for us as well. I mean, there's a lot of growers out there and a ton of samples that need to be taken, so it's going to take a lot of planning on the agency's part to make sure it's done properly.
All right. So somebody's asking, is there going to be enough labs for all the growers?
Currently, you're allowed to use any laboratory. So until we get a list of labs that are actually certified, once we finalize the Cannabis Quality Control Program, we'll start certifying laboratories. And then when we finally get a comfortable group of labs to be certified, then we will require a certified laboratory. So right now you can use your current laboratory you're using and for this fall right now. So
great. So I'm going back to the kind of cuts question and what's being sampled. And Bob, I see you put in there, maybe we should have some pictures, and I think that definitely might be helpful.
Okay.
Somebody asked, must that 2-inch sample be only flower? Or do we cut the end 2 inches off the sidearm and send them for testing in its entirety, including that small bit of stem and leaves that may be on that last 2 inches along with the flower?
That's what you would do. Yeah, you wouldn't just strip the flower off of the stem and pluck all the little fan leaves. You would basically just take that cut, leave the stem in there, leave whatever leaves are on there, and that's your cut. So it will come with some stem and leaf material.
Okay, great. There's a couple of questions about kind of the pesticide testing, and one is, well, this is about methanol. So I believe California and Oregon set action limit for residual methanol at 5,000 micrograms per gram, whereas I see Vermont is now at 3,000. Is that action limit effective immediately, and why is it lower than California or other states? And she said ethanol, not methanol. Sorry,
okay.
Ethanol.
Yeah, I think ethanol was 5,000. I'd have to look at it, but we were consistent with a lot of other states. I'm trying to think where we got all our values from. Got them from a lot of different sources. So sometimes it was a AHPA or USP or whatever the industry kind of went with, we decided to go with as well. So there was some industry or group that we used for the solvents for our reference list. I think it was UHP or USP. And even all those initials now, they're all mixing together, but we try to use an industry standard, so.
Okay. So somebody asked, as a lab testing moisture content, if customers are submitting samples freshly cut and we are not drying them here, they will be above 13%. Are customers or labs required to dry samples before testing?
That's a good point, yeah, Mike. But so for harvest crop, no, we want those to go right to the lab. So and so there is no 13% requirement of the action level for a harvested crop, because we know that's going to be, you're going to be 70 or 80% water with a harvested crop. So that 13% only kicks in for like trim flour or biomass, or even like an infused product like a brownie or something like that. So we want to make sure you're below the 0.13% so that you don't have molds, forming molds and stuff like that.
For your pre-harvest sample, the lab is going to dry it out anyways before they run it.
and that's we're looking. Some labs are drying it out ahead of time. Some are chopping it wet and cold and freezing it and stuff like that. So we're kind of looking at those techniques right now. But a lot of the methods call for pre-drying and then grinding in the lab. Super cool, so you don't convert it into cannabinoids during the grinding process and stuff. So there's a lot of different techniques. Willing to look and see what the labs are doing. We like them to use latest industry standards to make sure we don't lose crops or have things, compounds get changed over, cannabinoids and stuff like that during the grinding processes. So we're relying on them to do due diligence and validate their methods.
So if they're a certified lab or become a certified lab, you would be approving these methods anyway, correct?
Yeah, so that's what we're going to require, is that you'd actually be working towards an accreditation, and then we're going to be certifying the laboratory for hemp testing. So we're not an accrediting agency. We're just going to be certifying that they're meeting our guidelines.
Okay. Okay, so we have a few more minutes for questions. Somebody asked, at least some of the pesticides that are being tested that are, we're being asked to meet these limits are not allowable in hemp. Are you assuming that those are drifting in?
These are some pesticides we've seen problems with either in other states or in our state. And they have been drifted in, or we've seen them in concentrates. So like I say, even if you have a part per trillion value, by the time you concentrate that out, you might have 100 or 1,000-fold concentration. So now you're starting to see them at part per million. You start to get that detected. And so it's nice that the farmer actually, if he tests the pesticides on his crop end, and he can say, I was compliant on the crop end, my concentrate exceeded it, but I still didn't spray this, but it might have been drift over from something else. So these are problems that we've had or seen in other states or our state for a lot of these pesticides. So.
Okay, great. I kind of asked this privately in the chat, but I guess I'll ask it out loud. I was curious why organic, production didn't have to have the pesticide residue testing, especially if, we're thinking that there may be drift in from other fields. And, there still are pesticides used in organic production as well. So I was just curious why that determination was made.
Yeah, we made a conscious decision to try to, since there was testing being done by these certified organic growers, so they had requirements and they could have drop-by visits and stuff like that. So their fields, I guess, can be tested at any time. So they're kind of under scrutiny anyway. So I don't know if Stephanie can add anything to that, but that was kind of our thought, since not duplicating a lot of effort and a lot of testing at this point. So Stephanie, do you have anything to add on?
I don't have anything to add outside of, misuse of a pesticide is a misuse of a pesticide, whether it's an organic pesticide or a non-organic pesticide, conventional pesticide. And I mean, this doesn't specifically answer your question, Heather, but you know, that's a whole different program and potential different enforcement action. I think we were just looking at what was happening in other states and tried to dial in a list that.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just curious. I don't
Yeah.
need to push the issue. I just curious.
No, it's good. We appreciate the question.
Yeah. Okay. I think we have time for one more question. And it looks like there's maybe a directed question to you and Mike and Bob, just saying that they'd really like to work with you from Lauren. And I think, Lauren, you're with Efficiency Vermont and presented with us last week. So that's in the chat box for you folks to respond to. Otherwise, I think we answered all of the questions. Let me go back to Q&A here. Yeah, I think we're out of questions. That's great. The Agency of Ag website, it was up a second ago. It's down, but there's information in the chat box, and I think everybody knows how to get a hold of Michael and Stephanie and Robert, and we really appreciate your time today and answering everybody's questions. Great information, so thank you so much. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted in a week or so for people to listen to again, and if you have more questions, please do reach out to the folks at the agency. They're obviously super helpful and want to help us all be successful. So thank you again for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you again on September 10th. And Bob, I think you're presenting as our last webinar presenter in the series, so we'll be hearing from you again soon.
Good. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks,
All right,
everyone.
thanks so much.
Have a great day. Bye.
Take care.